Welcome to On the Go with AAUW, the American Association of University Women. I'm Kathleen Myers, your host and moderator. This episode is exciting, so be sure and stay tuned. I have as my guest this evening, Kata Bartaloni-Tuazon. She is, welcome Kata.
Thank you.
She is the author of a very exciting book and a historian. And the book that we're going to be discussing is the early presidency of George Washington. And the title of the book is
For Fear of an Elective King. And the subtitle is George Washington and the Presidential Title Controversy of 1789.
Yeah, and who knew there was a title controversy in 1789?
It's true, it's true. It was the first debate between the House and the Senate, and the first dispute about constitutional intent.
Constitutional intent.
And it happened within the first few weeks of the opening of the government in 1789.
How fascinating. Here we are, a young nation, and that is your area of study, is that correct?
Yes, well, that's what I'm most interested in. I really like the unsettledness, the unpredictability of the early constitutional era. And that's one of the reasons that I was drawn to the presidential title controversy.
So here we elect a leader. We're a brand new country. We've got a brand new leader, a brand new form of government, and we can't decide what to call this leader?
The Constitution just says he's the President of the United States. Although in the Constitutional Convention, they had actually named him as Excellency.
Excellency.
And for a lot of the summer of 1787, when they were putting the Constitution together, that title was in there. But when the Constitution went to be ratified, it had been taken out, and only the civic office title of President of the United States remained. But a lot of people wondered whether the president should have a title. All the governors were called Excellency or Honorable. It was even in a couple of state constitutions that they needed to have that kind of formal, more elegant address. So there was a question, should the president, this new president, be elevated above or at least equal to the governors of the states?
Interesting. So we could have called him King George, and that would have been awkward because there was a King George in England.
That's true. That's true. Plus, they just fought a war, a revolution against a singular central executive, that is King George of England. And so calling him King George Washington was not really an option. But at the same time, they wanted the new president of the United States to be on the same level with not only the governors, but also the other monarchs in the rest of the world.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the debate itself started not in the public, but the first phase of that debate was with the House and the Senate. Can you tell me about that?
Yes. People had started wondering what they were going to call the president even before the House and the Senate reached a quorum and began meeting, which was in April of 1789. But shortly after they reached a quorum and the House and Senate began having business, there was on April 23rd, 1789, Richard Henry Lee, one of the senators from Virginia, worried about this. He was worried about what to call the president, and he asked that there be a committee to look into this. And it was actually the same day Washington was arriving in New York City, and then he was inaugurated a week later. So he's arriving in New York City. It's a big deal. And people in the Congress are wondering, what are we going to call this guy? So the first part of the argument over how to address the president happened in the legislature, although everyone was worried about it. once the legislature came to a decision 3 weeks later, when the Senate basically said, okay, we won't give him a title and we'll go with what the House wants, which is just the simple civic title of president. Then the newspapers started covering it because they announced this. The Senate was meeting behind closed doors, so no one really knew most of what was going on. And when they announced that this was their resolution, that they weren't going to give him a civic title, they weren't going to give him a regal title, even though the Senate went on record saying, we think he should be His Highness.
His Highness.
But we're going to capitulate to the House, and the House doesn't want a Highness or any kind of title. We're just going to call him President of the United States. When this was reported in the news, people all summer and fall, it was like a Twitter video gone viral. People argued, wrote poems, plays, broadsides, newspaper articles, and even though the legislature had decided, everybody wanted to talk about it. Everyone had opinion about whether it was the right decision or not.
What was the general feel of the population?
Most of the population was very happy that there was no regal title. They were anti-monarchical. The revolution was very fresh in their minds. They did not favor Highness or Majesty. But there were a substantial number of people, and some of them were influential newspaper publishers, who wrote and advocated for something like Majesty, His Highness, Serene Highness. People even suggested Washington as a title.
Just Washington?
Washington as the title for the president, so that all subsequent presidents would have the same virtues and the same prestige as George Washington.
Oh, if that were only true.
So it would be Washington Obama, President of the United States.
I'll be darned. Boy, that would get confusing.
Yes, it
after
would.
a while.
Especially
when they moved the White House to Washington.
That's exactly right. So, there were a lot of different ideas out there. There were those that were very concerned about the United States and their prestige on the world stage. But John Adams and Richard Henry Lee, those who really advocated for a regal title or a strong title of some kind, their concern mostly was that the Senate actually would be so strong that they would corrupt the president. Not Washington, because he was strong enough, but subsequent presidents wouldn't maybe be at the same level of prestige. They were worried about future generations. So the people who were against a strong title worried about the president becoming a monarch. But those who wanted a strong title worried that he'd be corrupted and weak.
Now, Washington was a very humble guy.
He was very careful about his appearance and very careful to be disinterested and to appear simple and modest and humble in his dealings with the public.
And John Adams is the vice president at this time.
Yes, Adams, and he's also president of the Senate.
And president of the Senate.
Yeah.
Was he concerned with what they were going to, how they would refer to him? When the first title committee met, they were looking at all executive titles. And so when Richard Henry Lee first proposed that a committee consider this, a committee of both the Senate and the House, they were going to look at both executive titles, the president and the vice president. Well, because I was thinking if we go with His Highness or Excellency, then would he be the Vice Excellency?
Well, in the newspapers, they had titles for the Senate, they had titles for the House, they had titles for everyone.
Oh, my.
And a lot of things were considered. Often you would see Highness or Majesty proposed for the president and Excellency proposed for the vice president. But Adams's concern really was that the president, whoever he was, would have this authority that he thought a title would give him over any elites from the Senate, because the Senate is mostly made up of, at that time and also this time to some degree, state elites that have very powerful interests.
Well, they were just appointed at that time. They weren't elected.
Exactly. Well,
like we do
yes,
now.
Not the same.
Not the same way. Not by the populace.
Exactly. Exactly. And you know, now the Senate doors are open, but at that time they were closed. And that's why the public phase, where people just argued about this and wondered about not just the title for the president, but national character. Should we continue to have titles for our governors? Should we continue to call them Excellency and Honorable? And slowly but surely, as the whole title controversy unfolded, and the side who was against a grand title gained ground, there was also a movement against having titles for governors.
Okay, and I don't think we call them Your Excellency.
Not really.
Today. I've heard honorable.
You hear honorable. Once in a while, you still hear a governor referred to as Excellency in passing. One, I think the Massachusetts states, the state constitution may still designate it, but I'm not sure about that. But they're sometimes called that sort of as a throwback to tradition. But yes, through the years, it's definitely died away.
Well, how interesting. I didn't even know there was this controversy way back when. Now, you have your doctorate in history.
Yes, I do.
You do?
From George Washington University.
Excellent,
which
thank
is
you.
pretty apropos to my subject.
But how in the world did, of all the things you could write books about, how in the world did you come to write a book about this?
Well, I am very interested in aspects of leadership in general, and also not just what makes a leader, but how people respond to a leader, what people want from a good leader. As I said before, the unsettledness and of the constitutional era is very interesting to me. So my interest in leaders and leadership, and also people's response to leaders, led me to want to look at the early presidency. The title controversy being a very early argument in Congress had never really been examined. In fact, it's usually a punchline at the beginning of historians' talks on the early presidency. They say, oh, there was this controversy and Washington was almost called Highness. And there's usually a titter in the audience and everybody gets loosened up and then they go on. So it's sort of a little punchline. Also, John Adams was behind his back called his rotundity and mocked for being in favor of a title.
Dear.
So again, that makes really good press if you want to start a lecture. But the fact of the matter is the title controversy allowed me to look at the evolution of executive power and also people's attitudes toward extent of executive power, which is a huge issue even today, very emotional and very controversial. So there was a lot more going on than some kind of silly version of etiquette or pompousness or any of that. There was this issue of politics on the world stage and corruption of the office, and also the issue of status within the American populace. You know, should people go around with titles, and should not just governors have titles, but should even people be called Mr. and Esquire? there was an awful lot of, after the revolution, there was a lot of people running for office. Every time you'd run for office, you'd get a title. You'd be Mr., or you'd be judge, or and then you would have a profession, you'd be doctor. And a lot of these men in particular like to retain these titles, military titles. People hung on to them for life, even when they were out of the military. They were a general or a lieutenant till the day they died.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
even though Washington was just president of the United States, during the Revolutionary War, he was referred to as Excellency. So he already had that title from the war. He was a general. He had that title. So until the day he died, he was never just Mr. President. He was also the general. He was Your Excellency. In correspondence, people still called him that. In public documents, he was just the president. But what you hear today, Mr. President, in lots of press conferences, that wasn't something that happened during Washington's time. But the title controversy paved the way for the fact that we would have a Mr. President, that would be the wave of the future.
Very democratic.
Democratic, and yet the presidency is a strong office. And in some ways, as Adams, as vice president, he was mocked somewhat, and he got an awful lot of flack for promoting the high titles. And as a result, Washington backed away from him a little bit, and he didn't want to be associated with him quite as much. My thought is that Adams spent just a little bit too much of his time in the Senate, being president of the Senate, and watching over those senators that he was worried were going to corrupt the president, so that he sort of backgrounded the vice presidency, that whole position. And even though he didn't get a grand title, he did get a strong president, because the president really did not depend on the vice president for much of anything.
Oh, that's like today.
Yes. Well, I think that was a precedent that started because of the title controversy.
Because of the title controversy.
We got a diminished. We ended up with a more diminished vice presidency, and a stronger president out of it.
Yeah, interesting.
In spite of the fact that we had a simple title. In fact, because we have a simple title, and people could trust the presidency more. Yeah.
Well, I think we wanted a government, of the people, for the people, by the people.
That's true.
So we wanted to think of our president as people, not as someone who was born to it. Like some of the monarchies, they were born to it. They got the title of king, and it was going to be passed on only to that small group of people.
Divine right, and that is not what the United States is based on. It's based on a popular sovereignty, not on a monarchical sovereignty. And what the title controversy did was help the country reaffirm its love of the whole democratic tradition and the basic values and ideals of the revolution, which they were kind of afraid the Constitution might have lost for them a little bit by creating this singular executive. So as long as they could have this model title for the president. And also, that was what Washington wanted. It was clear that he didn't want a title himself, a grand title. So he is basically bowing to the people on that. He's agreeing with the people. So the people were getting the president agreeing with them, and they were getting the modest title associated with the presidency. So they became more comfortable with the office.
So this is so much larger than just a title controversy. It really got people thinking about, gee, what kind of a government do we have now anyway?
Yeah.
And in that constitutional process, there were some compromises that had been made. So not everyone was thrilled, I imagine. So, but this was a way of forcing the people to really stop and think about where we were going.
During the Constitutional Convention, and if you look at the Constitution, the first article, Article 1, is about Congress, and it's quite long and detailed. Article 2 is about the presidency. After they say how he's going to be elected and there's going to be a president and a vice president, defining the powers is 3 paragraphs. It's so short. It was so controversial, even during the Federal Convention or the Philadelphia Convention, that it's still being debated till today, what exactly the extent of presidential powers are. So what we know, though, is that in the beginning, one of the main principles for democratic executive leadership that came out of the title controversy is that the people want a president with some modesty. And they want a president that listens to their will. And sometimes people will argue today that, well, the modern presidency is a very strong presidency, that it's not modest anymore. But if you notice that many presidents spend a lot of time looking like a regular guy. They play basketball. They go gather brush. They watch football. They don't like broccoli.
You're right.
You know, they play the saxophone.
And it's just like me.
Yes, exactly. So there's still ways in which this whole cultural phenomenon of modesty plays out, even though the presidency has become a much, over time, a strong position, one that is often embattled with the House and the, in the Senate.
Sure. Well, our position in the world is different than in George Washington's day. I don't think we really garnered the respect of the rest.
We were a new nation, totally young, very maverick.
But it's interesting, too, because you talk about the modesty, and I think about, we see, Ronald Reagan on his ranch. But then when we see other things, we say, well, gee, that's not very presidential. So there's a fine line that they walk, that
That's right.
They want to look like real folks, but they don't want to look unpresidential.
Right. Right. So there's something they do in their private life that is okay because that makes them a regular person. But when they're out being the president, there is often an expectation. It's not so much an expectation that they'll be grandiose as an expectation that they'll have a certain gravitas. And if you don't meet that expectation, and sometimes, it comes out of nowhere for a president, these little cultural blips of what color suit you wear, for example, to some kind of political function. But overall, people do not want the president to have livery.
Yes.
or to, you can have a state dinner, but there is an elegance that is okay, but not a grandiloquence. There is a delicate kind of tightrope that a president does walk in order to remain on the right side of this issue with the people. And
so true.
It's not just, I talk about it now in terms of habits and etiquette, but it also has to do with how people see the presidency as a position and executive power, and whether they trust it or not.
Oh, trust is a big issue.
Yes.
So it's about a president's character.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And there, at the time in 1789, there was no way that the people were going to be comfortable with a president who had a kingly title. Even the title of Washington wouldn't have been acceptable because, well, first of all, Washington was a hero. What happens if that name would be used by a president in the future who was not as virtuous, who is more corrupt? Somehow, then you're diminishing the name of this person that you consider a hero.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, that's an excellent point. Kata, I really want to thank you for being on the show and sharing all these wonderful insights.
Well, it's gone so
with
quickly,
us.
I can't believe it.
It's just
Thank you very
fascinating.
much.
It's gone too quickly. We're going to have you back again. But I really encourage our viewers to get up there on your website, check out more about this book and all the fascinating stories that Kata brings us about George Washington and that era of history. And thank you, dear viewers, for watching our show. And don't forget to set your DVRs so that you'll never miss an episode of On the Go with AAUW. And be sure and tune in next time to see where On the Go is going. And yeah, we're going to have you back.
I would love to come back.
Well,
It
we'd
was
love
great.
to have
It was
you
very
back.
nice to be
Thank
here
you.
tonight. It's a pleasure, completely.
Thank you so much. Fascinating
Thank you.
topic. And I'm sure our viewers are going to enjoy this very much and want to do some more research on it as well.
Thank you.
So thanks again. Thanks again for joining us.